So we'll then start this talk. My name is Patricia Vieira. I coordinate the Eco Amazon project, and it is within the Eco Lecture series that I'm very pleased to welcome James Andrew Whitaker today, who is going to give a talk. And I'm really pleased that we managed to organize this and that we are going to have the opportunity to hear about his work on Guyana. James Whitaker is a social anthropologist. His research focuses on ethnography and ethnohistory in lowland South America. And he has worked with the Makushi people in Guyana for a very long time, for over a decade. He's an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Southern Mississippi and an honorary research fellow at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. He has a PhD in anthropology from Tulane University, and he was a postdoctoral fellow at CNRS in French Guiana. He has also held various visiting positions, namely at the University of Helsinki, at the Université Paris-Nanterre, and so on. He's the author of The Shamanism of Ecotourism, History and Ontology Among the Makushi in Guyana, which came out last year with Cambridge University Press. And he has also co-edited several other volumes on the topics of his research, including Indigenous Alliance Making, Histories of Agency in Colonial Lowland South America, which also came out last year with the University of Arizona Press. Sorcery in Amazonia, a comparative exploration of magical assault from 2024, and Climate and Ecological Change in the Americas, a perspective from historical ecology. So I would like to welcome James to the Eco Lecture series. And again, to reiterate that it's a pleasure and an honor to have him here with us today. And I'll give him the floor.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Patricia. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Give me just one moment to share screens, and I will begin. All right. Can everyone see my screen? Okay. Getting nods. All right. All right, so the title of my talk for today is Strategic Alliances and Ontological Modes Among the Makushi. And what we'll be discussing are basically a number of projects that are interwoven together that I've been working on since 2012. The longest account of these projects all in one place is the monograph that Patricia mentioned a moment ago, The Shamanism of Ecotourism, History and Ontology Among the Makushi and Guyana. The circulated papers, the two articles, are parts of this broader project. And then the edited volume from last year, Indigenous Alliance Making, is another part of it. And so I've kind of interwoven those into one narrative today. And really what my work is doing is looking at the way that Makushi people conceptualize their interactions with outsiders in the past and the present. That's at the center of it. Within that, notions of reciprocal relationships, questions about the modalities of those relationships, notions of climate change, ideas about historical relations, and even, for example, things like sorcery have fit into that broader series of debates. But it's really the conceptual frameworks of engagement that are at the heart of all of the projects that I've done in Amazonia. And so my work is primarily with the Makushi people in Guyana. I've worked in two villages in particular in terms of this work. Before I keep going, let me start a stopwatch so that I don't run over time and talk for over an hour or something. But there are two villages in particular that my project has really centered on, Sarama and Upukari village. I've also done some work with Akawayo, and I've written about other groups in relation to ethnohistory. But my field work is centered on those two villages. Those are the two villages with the most long-term and extensive ecotourism operations in Guyana. They date back to the 90s, and I'll be talking about that a little bit more later. But these are very different villages. They're both majority Makushi, but Sarama is really a mixed village with some other indigenous groups, such as a few Arikana people, that some of the founders were actually Arawakan. and a few Wapishana people, for example. There are also some non-indigenous Guyanese people in Surama as well. Overall, the village is a little over 300 people. Upukari village is significantly larger. I believe it was somewhere between 6 and 700 when I was last there in 2021. It's much more consistently Makushi people in Upukari, but it also has people coming in and out. And so there are a number of different backgrounds to the people that I've talked to and encountered and worked with in these projects. The central debates that I'm building off of go back to ideas of cosmologies and ontologies of contact. And a lot of this is rooted in the 1980s debates between Marshall Sahlins and Gananetho Basquieri. That's where a lot of this came to the broader attention of anthropologists, and it had to do with the frames, conceptual and otherwise, through which indigenous people understood their interactions with outsiders. And of course, Sahlins argued for this kind of grandiose framing of the Europeans, and that the indigenous people in the South Pacific saw the colonists as effectively something like gods. And Obasquieri argued that the frame of rationality was much more symmetrical between indigenous and non-indigenous people within that context. Those debates have moved, they've shifted, they've transmogrified in many ways as they've entered into Amazonia. And in the writings of Bruce Albert and Alcida Ramos, particularly an edited volume called Pacificando o Branco, they write about the ways that indigenous people seek to pacify or to basically socialize the outsiders within their remit. They talk about more of an agentive approach, whereas it's not always just indigenous people being moved upon, but that indigenous people also are moving, that they're basically taking agency in these interactions. And Aparecida Vilasa, in her book Strange Enemies in 2010, she begins to incorporate themes from the work of Eduardo Viveros de Castro, of course, the framework of Amerindian perspectivism, into these broader debates and looking at the ways that basically the changes that occur in missionization are conceptualized as bodily transformations involving perspectives and temporary perspectives at that, somewhat akin to shape-shifting among some indigenous groups, such as the Wari in Amazonia. What my work does in the context of these broader debates is that it broadens the time scale, looking back into the early 19th century and sometimes even deeper into the 18th century. And then it also, and comparing those past contexts to contemporary ones with ecotourism. And it looks at tourism and contemporary development as one of the contexts in which these kinds of ontological encounters can occur. There's been surprisingly little literature on that topic, really, in anthropology. And so I'm looking at those two things and also asking what is specifically Makushi about some of these encounters? What about Makushi historical memory, Makushi experiences, their conceptual frameworks? What have they made of these encounters themselves, and how do they see them in the present? At the heart of my work is really a central argument that Makushi groups have used shamanic frameworks in the past and present to structure their relations with outsiders, such as missionaries and ecotourists, in ways that facilitate strategic alliances, acquisitions of desiderata or desired things, both material and immaterial, and local projects of transformation. And so what I'm arguing is that Makushi people position the outsiders that come in through tourism in the present, in the past as missionaries, they position them as something akin to shamanic familiar spirits. It's not that they see them as inherently spiritual beings per se, but it's a structural relation that they're in a parallel setting, they're in a parallel positioning as these other beings, and that allows them to intentionally use certain shamanic frameworks in order to draw them into their villages and to basically achieve their goals in managing and maintaining and sometimes also ending these kinds of relationships. Let me explain what that means in terms of shamanic frameworks and this shamanic familiar spirit positioning. Makushi people generally talk about more than human beings in the landscape that control other non-human beings in the landscape. In other words, there's a master owner or a Palaryamo. Sometimes it's called a guardian. The word in Makushi, plural, would be Palaryamo. And that this being controls, it guides, protects, it guards the non-human beings or the feature of the landscape under its protection. So, for example, wild peccaries, a kind of wild pig in the Amazon, it has one of these beings. Certain birds do, fish do, at least certain fish. Some plants do as well. There's a cassava mama that's basically a kind of guardian protector of the cassava plants. And before you can hunt, fish, or even harvest cassava, you need to give something to this more than human being. It establishes preemptive reciprocity and ultimately balanced forms of reciprocity between humans, the community at large, and these more than human beings. If you don't do this, you get negative reciprocity. And this is fairly common across Amazonia. But basically, the person that doesn't engage in symmetrical relations is likely to get sick, or their family gets sick, or they get what the Makushi call fits. And fits, it's something like insanity, but it could be understood as akin to the descriptions in other societies of a kind of preying on the soul, where a person may slowly change into a non-human being, like an animal. Makushi people don't talk as much about those kinds of therianthropic transformations, except in shamanism, sorcery, and death. But there is a sense in which the perspective is being pulled. They usually use the word fits to describe it. So, in other words, Makushi people go to great lengths to manage the relations with more than human beings through an ontological frame. This is all within the landscape. And shamans are often the ones that actually manage these relations. A hunter may leave tobacco or alcohol for the padru that controls the particular animal that they're planning to hunt. But when the relations go awry, it's the shaman's role, the pia song in Makushi, to manage to recalibrate those relations. Okay, well, so they also see these relations as relevant to landscape features like mountains, rivers, certain parts of the forest that sometimes are called sacred sites in Guyana. And they maintain relations with these areas and beings through these more than human beings. The parallelism with tourism occurs because there are beings that basically bring the tourist in. It's nonprofit organizations or companies or just individuals, sometimes universities or professors even, that are bringing in the outsiders. And the herds of tourists are parallel to the herds of peccaries that basically are the contemporary equivalent in terms of providing the desiderata that are needed for economic life. Both of the villages that I work in, Saram and Yupukari, are economically centered on tourism. And so the money that's paid for tourism, the forms of knowledge and technology that are sometimes acquired through the tourist or their leaders, and also the connections that give Makushi people both social and political capital in regards to securing indigenous land rights or to learning about new occurrences and linking with those occurrences in the outside world in regards to things like climate change. Those are all within this touristic frame. And the shamanic framework of mastery and ownership is applied to it such that you have effectively master owners now of tourists who must be allied with, managed, and reciprocated with in order to ensure continued provisions. This picture on the right is where a lot of this happens. It's certainly where it happened in the quote unquote ethnographic present of when I was in Sarama from 2012 to 2020 in a series of visits. And this is the Sarama Eco Lodge business office. On the front, you see an internet satellite. This is where most of the bookings were made. On the right, you see a small phone on top of a pedestal. It's kind of hard to see, but that little cement pedestal has a phone on it. And these were the main ways that the people in the village at large, but certainly in the Eco Lodge business office, would communicate with outsiders. Now there's a broader Wi-Fi network in the middle of the village, and so it's a little bit less limited in terms of communications. But even though Sarama is remote, the same with Yupukari, it's by no means isolated. And in Sarama, there were as many as 800 to 1,200 or more tourists entering a village of only a little over 300 people on an annual basis during many of the years when I was doing field work. And so this is the site where it occurs. And I write about at the very beginning of the monograph about how, in effect, Sarama fetched me. And the word fetch is a term used quite a bit in Guyanese Creole to bring things into something intentionally. It's a term that was used in the historical documents in relation to the missionaries. A Makushi man tells a missionary named Thomas Yude, who we'll talk about in a little bit, that now that we have fetched you and you have come and we like you, that, and this is kind of a paraphrased beginning of a quote from the archival documents. And that term fetch it implies an agentive, intentional drawing in of outside people and outside goods and resources. And so once I sent an email expressing interest in going to Sarama, doing research, et cetera, back in 2012, within a couple of days, I received a phone call. and they were interested in the project. They were seeing what they could do to help and talking about what kind of accommodation that I might need. And they took much, much more agency and much more intentional outreach than I had ever really heard of in terms of somebody doing ethnographic fieldwork, where we kind of assume that it's going to take a while to establish some contact and then to get interest from local people. But instead, they basically took the initiative very early on, and it became much more of a back and forth dialogue rather than me trying to just get permissions and then go and trying to explain it to everyone. Then they were right off the bat interested in this. And so that kind of eagerness to engage with outsiders and that kind of active drawing in of the outside, as I learned more about the Makushi, both in the present but also through ethnohistorical documents, I started to see that pattern had recurred in a number of circumstances in the past and present. So this picture, in my view, is somewhat emblematic of these relations. And as you see on the right on this next slide, it also is the cover of the book, because I think that this is really where it all began. And this really, in some ways, in an image, sums up a lot of the Makushi strategies of engaging with outsiders, that in some ways they've held on to much of their traditional quote unquote life. They still do cassava farming, hunting, fishing. There's still a lot of thatch buildings in the village. They talk about many of the same stories that I've read about from the 19th century about cosmological brothers like Inshkirung and Negi, etc. But at the same time, that they're also very, very forward-facing, agentive, and strategic in forming alliances with outsiders. And that's not new either. So, in terms of my ethnographic methodology, it's fairly classic anthropological field work. I use qualitative field work involving participant observation and open-ended interviews. These interviews are focused on the themes that I've just been mentioning: cosmology, historical memory, and ontology. And I've done 244 interviews so far in Sarama since 2012 and 50 interviews in Upukari. And my work in Upukari is a little more recent. That was part of my postdoctoral work with the CNRS in France. And that project was building off of this project, and it was also looking at conceptual frameworks of encounter. But it was, in addition, bringing in the dimension of climate change and how Makushi and Akawayo people had acquired and adopted discourses of climate change, how they understood those in terms of local experiences and how they used these discourses, and also how they conceptualized the causes and the solutions to climate change within their territories and landscapes. And so the ethnographic part I just described, but the archival part is a little less common for anthropologists. A lot of anthropologists these days do use documents, but often there's more of a focus on ethnography. And I've tried to really balance as best I can the ethnographic focus with an ethnohistorical focus. And so the archival work that I've done involves reading primary source documents from a number of different places. Early on, I was trying to just really go through as many of these as I could find from colonists, missionaries, etc. But some of the places where I found relevant work were the National Archives of Guyana in the Georgetown, the capital of Guyana, the Bodleian Library at Oxford, the National Archives at Kew in London in the UK, the British Jesuit Archives on Farm Street in London in the UK, and particularly the Church Mission Society. And this is at the Cadbury Research Library at the University of Birmingham in the UK. And the Church Mission Society is an Anglican mission organization. It exists even today, but I don't think they do as much international missionization as they once did. But these encounters with Anglican missionaries from the CMS are some of the most intensive interactions that have been documented in the 19th century between Makushi people and European outsiders. This document on the right is an example of part of this. It comes from a missionary named Thomas Yude, who I'll talk about more in a few minutes. And it's from 1838 in a village called Parara, a Makushi village relatively close to Brazil. This particular document is talking about his first mission to the Makushi at Parara, but Yude was actively drawn in. He's the one that Makushi people at the time referred to as having fetched into their village. And it was a very strategic effort to draw him in. I'll talk more in a few minutes about the methods that they use, but they're quite similar to the way that they described what they could do in relation to helping with my research project when they called me in 2012. This document, though, is part of the data for this project, and there were many others like it. All right. So one thing I should mention at this point is how does one use colonial era or mission related documents in an ethnographic project? Surely documents like that must be biased and they must be very limited. And of course, that's true. These historical documents have a lot of problems. They're very biased. The way that he thought about Makushi people was strongly framed through his particular formation as a missionary, particularly in that place and time, but just really in general in terms of wanting to change their culture and their society. But it's some of the only real data that we have from the past to be able to really go farther back in time. I've done a lot of focus on historical memory and oral history in the interviews that I've done with Makushi people. And in many cases, after asking about what they remember, what they've heard from their ancestors or from other community members, I'll also talk a bit about what I've seen in the documents and get their opinion on the documents. That's as close as we can get, though, in the present to getting kind of more firsthand information to the past other than the Europeans who were writing about it at the time. And so what I try to do with the documents is read the documents against the grain. In many ways, read the missionaries' accounts somewhat against perhaps the intent that the missionaries had, in the sense that I'm relying heavily on local indigenous interpretations of these documents and the material within them, and also on the way that through anthropological theory that we can try to open the gaps, the spaces, the lacuna between the different arguments in the documents to see more of an indigenous, in this case, Makushi voice coming out of the documents. And so in conjunction with ethnography, it gives us more of a past and present perspective rather than just an emphasis on the ethnographic present or just the documentary past. All right, so I should talk a little bit about ontology since that's clearly at the center of some of the way that I understand these frameworks through which Makushi people engage with outsiders. And the way that I use ontology here, it's not as a synonym for culture. It's really following Philippe Descolat's ideas of ontology from his well-known book, Beyond Nature and Culture in 2013. And I'm sure that most of you are quite familiar with, of course, this literature and these arguments, but just I'll give a brief sketch of it in case somebody might not be. But ontology for Descola, it's basically four different ontologies based on combinatorial permutations of the nature culture dichotomy. And what he's doing are looking at the ways that nature and culture can be related to one another. And it's not meant as necessarily a strict set of categories to label other societies, but as a way of thinking through the different ways nature and culture can be related. And sometimes, as we know in Amazonia, even in contexts where they're not necessarily opposing terms within local understandings of the world. And so the two ontologies coming from Descola that are most relevant to my project are naturalism and animism. Naturalism is the ontology of Western science. It basically says that the exterior of things or nature is shared between plants, animals, humans, even rocks. We all are made up of atoms, molecules, and for living things, cells and biomacromolecules, etc. But that the interior of things, the subjectivity or culture, in air quotes, is what differentiates different kinds of beings. We presume that we would have different forms of subjectivity than animals or certainly plants and most definitely rocks. But in animism, this is all inverted and turned upside down. In other words, that in indigenous myths, in stories, and shamanic experiences, in many aspects that indigenous of the world that indigenous people talk about, humans, animals, sometimes even plants, they talk to one another. They wear clothing, they get married, live in villages. In other words, they share something like culture, quote unquote. So it's the interior, the subjectivity or culture that's shared, and it's the exterior, the body, that differentiates. So a way of thinking about this is in line with what Viveris de Castro refers to as cosmological deixis, inferring a semiotic dimension. One way of thinking about it is that there's a shared signified in the mind between, using again Viveris de Castro's example, between humans, jaguars, and let's say tapirs. And for humans, that's the signifier that's associated with that algebraic X would be actual cassava beer, a liquid that's made from the fermentation of cassava plants and their material. For jaguars, it would be blood. For tapirs, it would be mud that they would roll around in, or peccaries for that matter. But basically, in the mind, all of these would refer to the same thing in terms of subjectivity, and that's the shared culture part. But the different bodies of humans, jaguars, and tapirs or peccaries, they would result in different things in the world being associated with the signifiers of those particular relations. All right, so the outside differentiates, the inside basically unites. That would be animism. Well, how does that have anything to do with missionaries or tourism or anything like that? Well, basically the relations between humans and more than human beings in the context of mastery and ownership interactions that I described earlier, that is quintessentially animistic relations, all right, in the Descalon sense of it. In other words, it's social relations between humans and non-humans for purposes of managing other relations between humans and non-humans. And the social distancing comes down to zero because there's a subjective personhood set of encounters between the human shamans, the human hunters, fisher folk, etc., who are engaging with the master owner beings and their wards. These frames become projected onto social relations in the context of European colonization and imperialism. In other words, the otherly beings known as European missionaries or today tourists, they're basically caught up in the same frameworks of dealing with alterity and otherness. And for indigenous people, the difference between nature and culture there, engagements with animals versus engagements with people, that wouldn't necessarily be a divide because, again, the ontology would be animist. It's not that they don't know the difference, of course, between the human missionaries and the animals in the forest, but they don't conceptualize it the same way that we would under a naturalist frame. And so, as an end result, the same relationships can be maintained in both domains, so to speak. All right, so ontology in this sense, it's a combination of the concepts of Descalon and Viveros de Castro, and this has been further developed in relation to these ideas of mastery and ownership and familiarization, implying shamanic familiars and the process of making something into that, that's written about by Carlos Fausto and Luis Costa and others. In some of the German anthropological accounts, these ontologies have been opened up a bit, though. Ernst Hallmeyer has written about whether or not it's really four, whether there might be five or even more ontologies that we could identify. And he's bringing in his work with the Yucpa in the Istmo-Colombian region in writing about this. And Matthias Levy has written about whether sound relations could be a part of it as well. And so that broadens it out even more significantly. I've written in the past about how perhaps ontologies sometimes are changing over time. And so, in other words, for Makushi people, that with some of their encounters with the educational systems in Ghana today, with missionization, et cetera, we do see perhaps a bit of nascent naturalism sometimes emerging within what otherwise would be an animist frame. Sometimes other ontologies also kind of are evinced in some of their relations. And so, again, it's not categories to put people in boxes, but they are useful labels that in talking with local people, we see that they can be useful concepts to think with. So broadly, ontology examines being, cosmology explores worlds, and I'm really looking at both of these things together in this project. These conceptual frameworks, they reveal the relational modalities through which various forms of interactions between humans and non-humans, but also humans and other humanly groups, such as, for instance, the indigenous people and the European outsiders, how those emerge in the past and present and how they're thought about by indigenous people. All right, so the picture on the right is basically the landscape of Sarama Village. That's where all of this
I'm sorry,
happened.
we're no longer seeing your presentation.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure what happened. Can you see it now?
Uh,
I was seeing the presentation.
I'm not seeing it. I'm just, yeah,
Okay, let me
now
try
I
again.
am. Yes.
Oh, okay. It maybe the screen went to sleep or something. Let me if everyone can see it, I'll go from there.
Yeah,
Is
no,
that
it's working. Thank you.
okay? Sorry, not sure what happened. This picture on the right is of the Sarama landscape. If you were looking at the picture of the Sarama Eco Lodge business office from a couple slides back, just flip back real fast, right here, and then you turned around 180 degrees, this is what you would see. And all of the pieces of the Makushi landscape are present here. The lowland savannas with scrub forest, the not really highland, but the high forest areas in the background. The Makushi territory is between the Pakarima Mountains, of which that mountain is one. It's called Sarama Mountain, and then the Kanaku Mountains to the south, much far to the south of Sarama. You can't see the Kanaku Mountains from there. And then there's a little house that a friend of mine lives in there on the edge of the forest. And basically, Makushi people live in the savannas, but they hunt, fish, and farm cassava in the forested areas. And so the places where they engage with these Padler beings are primarily in the forests. And similarly, most of the activities and many of the activity zones for tourists are also located in the forest, further paralleling encounters between or relations between basically the more than human master owner beings and the leaders of tourists, and perhaps sometimes even the tourists themselves. The Eco Lodge is also right on kind of the edge of the forest on one far end of the village, pretty far away from the center part of the village where most of the Makushi people live there. All right, so that just gives you a sense of the landscape. Now, let me move into the historical dimensions for a few moments and talk about where the Makushi first emerge in the documents and what we see through that documented history. The word Makushi first appears in print, as far as we know so far, in 1740 in Brazilian documents in relation to slaving raids that were occurring in Brazil in the Araraquara River region between Makushi people and also Wapishana people. There was an Irishman named Lawrence Belfort. He moves to Brazil, changes his name to Laurencio Belfort, and he starts to lead these resgate missions against, or expeditions against, Makushi people. And of course, the word means something like rescue, but they were really slaving raids against local indigenous people at the time. These had probably been going on against Makushi people for some time based on the fact that Belfort had led other raids, according to the documented history. But this is the first time the Makushi are mentioned by name. All right, in the 1750s and 60s, they emerged in Dutch documents in the writings of a colonial administrator, Dutch colonial administrator, Storm van Gravesande, who writes about them being at war with the Wapishana, also writes about them trading with the Dutch, etc. And then they appear in Portuguese records with the building of Fort São Joaquim in the late 1700s, and efforts to bring Makushi people near the fort for them to engage with, basically for the Portuguese colonists to exploit Makushi labor and other indigenous groups in the area at the time. All right, they continue to be mentioned sporadically, but the most intense interactions during this broader time period in the past is during the 1830s and 1840s. And in that context, the Church Mission Society missionaries come on the scene. John Armstrong, who's not on the slide, but he's very significant to this, he appears in the 1830s, and he makes a visit to the Makushi in 1833, and he recounts that Makushi people were trying to get him to create a mission in that area. They wanted him to create a permanent settlement among them. One could be speculative, one could be skeptical of these accounts because it would be in his interest to say that they wanted him to be there, of course. But they seem to actually have been interested because they were also reporting continued slaving raids occurring from Brazil. And it seems that they were interested in a mission station of British missionaries as a way of curbing the ongoing character of these slaving raids. And so they tried to get Eudes to stay. Eudes writes a letter to the Brazilian governor of the region protesting against the slaving raids, but he does not create a mission because he doesn't have permission from the CMS. Thomas Eudes joins John Armstrong a little bit later upriver at the Bartica mission. And Thomas Eudes makes his own visit in the mid-1830s to Parara, where Armstrong had previously visited. And he recounts that Makushi people offered to build him a house, to build a church, to plant cassava fields and plantains if he would create a permanent settlement. He tells them that he wants to and that he will eventually, but he can't yet. He goes back to Bartica, which was the upriver station that he and Armstrong were at the time. And then he records that Makushi, Akawayo, and other indigenous people made continued visits in the intervening years until he creates the first mission to the Makushi in 1838 in Parara. All right, so this mission is the first of three that he created. During this time, he very quickly gets into conflict with the Brazilian government, who sees what he's doing as trying to take over their territory and teach a foreign language and a foreign religion to the indigenous people in order to make them British subjects. And so he has conflict territorially. Thomas Eudes is joined by Robert Schomburgk, who is a German explorer and geographer who the British government had hired to map out and demarcate the interior boundaries between British Guiana and Brazil. And Schomburgk really latches on to the idea of the slaving raids as a way of basically arguing that the British territory should extend to the west into what at the time was really thought of as Brazilian territory by many people, particularly in Brazil, in order to make the raids stop. And so, in a way, the slaving raids or the idea of them become a part of broader imperialist ambitions in the UK. But there's no real plan, it seems, in this area outside of perhaps Robert Schomburg and maybe a few people in the colony. Peter Riviere refers to this as absent-minded imperialism in a book that he writes about these encounters with Schomburg, Eudes, and indigenous people at this time period in the 1830s and 40s. All right, so the Makushi people are still seemingly trying to basically balance the different colonial fronts. They had experienced raiding from Brazil. They had also experienced raiding in the past from indigenous, basically allies of the Dutch colonists to the east who would attack Makushi villages. And really, Makushi villages are mentioned as being attacked by these Dutch proxy groups more than any other indigenous groups. And then the proxy groups would sell the Makushi people as enslaved people to the Dutch. So when the British took over in the early 1800s, I believe it was 1803, and then they basically gained permanent territory in 1815. They turned the territory into British Guiana in 1831. Makushi people are concerned about being able to balance these colonial fronts and forces. And so ultimately, Schomburg, Eudes, in a sense, they have their own machinations of colonial interests, mission interests, imperial interests, but the Makushi are in some ways using these various fronts as well for their own interests. They're wildly successful in doing that. The indigenous people at the time were, perhaps more than they meant to be, since the Makushi case was heard before the British Parliament in the early 1840s. Then subsequently, British troops were actually sent into Parara at one time. But Eudes ended up moving his mission station because of the ongoing territorial disputes to a place called Urwa, later Waraputa. And those were the three missions he created. And he recounts similar interests at all three of these in not only creating this curve, but also in appropriating outside forms of knowledge, material goods, language in some cases. And early on, it seems that the goal of this was both protection from slaving raids, but also to gain new perspectives, the kinds of transformations of perspective that Aparecido Vilaça has described among Wari people in Brazil. So actually fairly similar, really, in this earlier time period. Eudes ends up dying on the way back to Britain in 1842, and a few other missionaries briefly visit the area, but they're not really able to hold the mission station because of illness and disputes and various things. This is the third one that he's at, not Parara. And in the 1850s, John James Lohr, another CMS missionary, enters the territory. He goes to where Eudes had previously been stationed, and he recounts very similar strategies that Makushi people were promising to build him a house, a church, to plant cassava and plantain fields, etc. The same strategies being used, and great interest is shown in him creating a mission. He doesn't do so because of the territorial disputes, but importantly, he mentions that Eudes was thought at the time to be living on top of a mountain. He's known to have actually died on a ship or briefly after getting off of the ship in Barbados on his way back to Britain. But basically, for the indigenous people, Eudes was living on top of a mountain where master owner spirits are often thought to reside. So Eudes had effectively become something like a master owner spirit himself in that region. And the way that they write about him sounds very similar to mastery and ownership relations, needing someone to lead, to kind of guide local people. That's the kind of language they use in talking to Lohr about their interest in a new missionary. All right, they also expressed concerns that the raids could start again, although by this point it seems like they had stopped occurring from the Brazilian side. James Williams enters Yupukari village decades later, but similarly recounts interest in him coming in, being drawn in, and creating a mission station. So James Williams was located at Yupukari village, which is one of the villages that I've done fieldwork in. And that's different than Parara, but we think that Parara village was actually quite close to what is now Yupukari village. The picture on the right is just some savanna land, but it's at a satellite village called, what's the name of it? Now I'm blanking on the name, but it's a satellite village of Yupukari. And basically, local people say that in the 19th century, there was a Dutch or British settlement there temporarily. I walked around that area back in 2021 and saw ceramics, glass bottle fragments, took pictures of these, showed them to some archaeologist friends in the US who identified them as likely being mid 19th century British ware that was basically located here in the Savannah zone. And so we're not sure exactly where Parara was located. There's a place called Parara today, fairly near the Brazilian border, but it's not thought to have historically been a village. It's now a rice field, basically. But we think that Parara was close to this area that's now called Yupukari and that satellite village station. All right, jumping ahead, in the 1990s, this area opened up significantly with ecotourism. Prior to that, the interior of Ghana had been largely closed off because of an uprising that occurred in the late 1960s against the Guyanese government by some landowners that did ranching in the interior zone. In the 80s, in particular the 90s, that began to open up more, and ecotourism begins in the region. Saram and Yupukari were early adapters and developers of tourism, and it continues into the present, although it changed a bit with the pandemic when, of course, most of those operations ground to a halt there for a couple of years. And I don't know what the numbers are today, but as I mentioned before, it was quite large numbers in the 2010s. Okay, so with ecotourism, we similarly see these efforts to draw in outsiders to promise food and lodging and other kinds of resources in order to establish balanced reciprocal relationships to get money, outside knowledge, social and political relations, etc. All right, so to reiterate kind of part of my broader argument, influenced by historical memory of enslavement, Makushi groups see quasi-shamanic and mutualistic strategic relations with certain outsiders, which are positioned as spirit familiars. These outside allies have historically ranged from Anglican missionaries in the past to ecotourists in the present. And the importance of the historical memory here is that Makushi groups place a particular emphasis on having more balanced or mutualistic relations with outsiders. In the 1980s and 90s, Amazonian ethnology emphasized this kind of balanced reciprocity within indigenous groups. And then in the late 90s and the 2000s, that has shifted towards a greater emphasis on the way that asymmetrical relations and hierarchy is established within these contexts, primarily based on ethnographies in other areas. And at the head of that, Luis Costa, Carlos Fausto, have particularly written about asymmetrical relations. Those asymmetrical relations are existent for quite a bit of the area, but perhaps the literature has shifted a bit too much towards asymmetry when some areas and some groups do actually emphasize more mutualism and balanced reciprocal relations, and that does seem to be the case with the Makushi. But in their case, it seems to particularly be influenced and basically inspired by concerns and memories of the past in which they were targeted by other indigenous groups, by Brazilian raiders, sometimes by other European colonists. There are accounts of British colonists exploiting Makushi people as well as Dutch colonists. And so the emphasis on mutualism between Makushi people and outsiders seems to be influenced by the historical memory, although they do recognize hierarchy and asymmetry in the relations of more than human and non-human beings in the landscape between, for example, the master owners of deer and the deer, and between outsiders that come into the village, such as the leaders of the tourists and the tourists themselves. There are also some hierarchical relations within Makushi society between village leaders and villagers, and between historically, for instance, like elder brothers and younger brothers and those kinds of relations. But there's an emphasis on mutualizing those interactions with outsiders. This building on the right is one of the cabins where tourists stay in Sarama village. And as you can see, it looks in some ways like a traditional building, but it's really almost entirely modified. The circular thatched roofing is a traditional design, but the hexagonal structure, the closed window, the bricked-in bathroom, the Arawakan-style stilted flooring, the stairs with the handrails, all of this is designed to be aesthetically pleasing to the tourists. And so they're building specifically to draw in outsiders in the present as well. So even the aesthetics kind of play a minor role in relation to these broader formations of strategic alliances. All right, so beginning to kind of wind things up a bit, how do Makushi people use strategic alliances with outsiders? And in the past and present, there have been a variety of different applications. The oldest would be resisting slaving raids, as we've seen. That's one form of combating territorial incursions, but those territorial incursions in the present also involve curbing illegal logging and mining. And that's associated not only with indigenous land rights, which are a primary concern for local people, but also countering climate change and deforestation. And I mentioned before that some of my work more recently, since 2021, is focused on conceptualizations of climate change among the Makushi and Akawayo. And they see climate change, many Makushi people at least, see climate change as a result of imbalanced relations with the non-human master-owner beings. In other words, that either exploitative relations where humans take more than they need or they don't give back to the Padre Yamu, it results in severe storms or in changes to temperature or in flooding or drought or lack of animals to hunt for food or crop failures and seasonal problems. And so in that context, climate change is part of the animistic social relations between Makushi people and the other beings within the landscape. And deforestation particularly is thought to drive that, since that particularly offends the Padre Yamu. There are other taboo offenses that also can do this, like putting hot pepper in the rivers, but I won't go into much detail on that. Also, these strategic alliances are related to broader transformations of the kind that we talked about before, similar to the Wari, in which there are changes that are made in conjunction with missionization and conversion or deconversion that are linked to bodily perspectives, and where taking on new forms of clothing, dress, speaking, and particularly eating and drinking, that's associated with becoming other. Right. And so, in other words, some people write about becoming white in this area. That's a theme that's common across Amazonia, but it doesn't mean necessarily literally turning into white people or Europeans. It often is more about the perspectives. And my reference to Kelly '05 there is talking about his work among the Yanomami in relation to very similar themes of becoming white. In the 19th century, colonial writings they recurrently mention this theme of Makushi and other indigenous people in the Guianas basically becoming or transforming into whites through taking on ritual practices that seem to center around modified versions of Anglican religious rituals or Catholic religious rituals, new forms of dress and speech. And I even had people tell me that in the context of working with the BBC, for example, that they had started dressing and eating differently. And one man said that he looked down one day and realized that he was becoming British, and that then he stopped some of what he was doing in order to regain his Makushi perspective. And so these narratives are ongoing. And that's really the way that the term development tends to be used by many people in Makushi villages today. It's not just economic and political changes, but also these broader bodily changes that are tied to differences in perspectives. All right, so the shamanic frameworks related to ontological animism, they're reflected in the formation and management of these alliances and the consequences of the alliances by Makushi groups today. Okay, so just to close, again, the two books that really I've gone into more detail in these themes within are my monograph, The Shamanism of Ecotourism, and then also the edited volume that came out last year, Indigenous Alliance Making. The two circulated readings talk about parts of this as well as hopefully you've been able to see from the broader contours of the talk. But I'm happy to answer any questions, and I greatly appreciate you having me here today. And I thank Patricia again for the invitation. Thank you.